In this lesson, we are going to talk about arrays. I have a very difficult time saying arrays, especially when I start talking faster, and it definitely does not come out correctly. So please bear with me when I say the term arrays, because if I want to say it correctly, I have to stop and think, okay, I need to position my mouth correctly. Arrays. And go from there. So what is an array? Well, it's a data structure, really. It's a way that we can store multiple values in a single variable. So let's look at this. We're going to create a variable called guitar. I'm a guitarist. I love to play guitar. I love to collect guitars. Some people say that I have too many. Some people being my wife, and I say that I don't, but she usually wins. So I want to have a page that displays my most favorite guitars that I own and guitars that I want to own. So we're going to start with a guitar called Vela. It's made by Paul Reed Smith. I have become a Paul Reed Smith fan because, well, I like the shape of their patterned regular neck, and especially with the Vela, the pickup configuration is it's wonderful. It has a single coil in the neck and a humbucker in the bridge, and it's just, it's an offset body. It's beautiful. It sounds great. It's a wonderful guitar. So that's going to be the first one that I want to have here. But, then I want to own a Gibson Explorer. I'm not a huge fan of Gibsons, but I want an Explorer. I like the shape of them and all of that stuff. But now, this is going to run into a problem because we've created a guitar variable. We have assigned it a value. And then we have reassigned another value to the guitar variable. So now we still have just a single variable, but now it contains Explorer. So we could get around this by changing the name of our variables so that we have Vela guitar, then we can have Explorer guitar, and let's add a third. We need to have a Strat. So we have a Strat guitar. And while this is going to work, this is not really feasible because as more guitars are added to this list, we have to add another variable, assign it a value, and then that's just another variable that we have to keep track of. It's not an ideal solution. So instead, we can use an array. I'm doing pretty good saying that so far. So we can have a variable called guitars, and then we can create an array in one of two ways. We can use the array function, and then we can pass in our values. So we would have Vela, and then Explorer. Well, we need a separate string there. Explorer, and then Strat. Notice that I am separating each of these with a comma. And this is the old way of creating an array. If you are, unfortunately, in an environment that is PHP 3 or below, then this is how you have to create an array. But 5.3 is many years old. Hopefully that you would be in at least 5.4 or above, and in which case you can use the newer syntax, which looks a lot like JavaScript. You just use the square brackets. So you have an opening square bracket, you define your values. Once again, they are separated by commas, and then you have the closing square brackets. So this is the syntax I'm going to use, and this gives us the ability to reference any one of these values at any given time. But how do we do that? Well, let's first of all do this. Let's echo guitars. Now, we aren't going to get what we would hope we would get. Let's go to the file. We get a notice, array to string conversion in arrays.php on line 5, and then we see array. So what we see here, array, is the result of our echo statement. We are trying to echo an array, but there is no conversion between an array and a string. So that's why we get the notice. It's not an error, but it is a notice. It's a warning. So all we see is array. Instead, we want to see the contents of that array. And so we can use a function called print r. And then we pass in our guitars array. And whenever we go back to the browser, we're going to have a nicely formatted output. But if we view the source, we're going to have even nicer. So we have array, and then we have our values. But notice here on the left-hand side, we have what's called an index. A normal traditional array has a list of values, and we access those values by specifying the index. And notice that this first index is 0. We start counting at 0 in PHP and in many other languages. There are some languages that start at 1, and they're just wrong. So we use this exact syntax here, the open square bracket, the index number, and then the closing square bracket to get whichever value that we need. So we can go back to our code, and let's do this. We're going to say echo guitars, and we want the guitar at index 0. That is going to be our first item in our array. So whenever we go back to the browser, let's refresh, we will see Vela. If we change the index to 2, we can count it 0, 1, 2. We're going to see Strat. But if we say index of 3, well, we don't have anything at index of 3. We get a notice. Once again, it's not an error, but it says that there's an undefined offset of 3. Sometimes you will see the term offset, and more often than not, you can translate that to index. So here's what we could do. There is a function called isSet. And if guitars at index 3 is set, then we can output that value. So we can use a decision here. If isSet guitars index 3, then we are going to echo that guitar. Otherwise, we'll have else. We will echo that the guitar does not exist. So we go to the browser. Let's refresh the page. And we have a fatal error. Uncaught error, call to undefined function is set. It helps if you actually do that correctly. There is no underscore in is set. So we see guitar does not exist. And unfortunately, this is one of the things that I have always said about PHP is that it is not consistent. There are many functions that have an underscore between the words. There are other functions that don't. And unfortunately, you just have to memorize which ones do and which ones don't. And apparently I haven't memorized that. So there is some inconsistency with the functions and the API given to us by PHP. But that's just the nature of the beast. We have to go with it. So this is a normal array. We access each individual item within that array with an index. So let's add a comment, and I haven't talked about comments, have I? If there's ever a time that you want to make PHP ignore some of your code, you can comment out that code, and you do so with 2 slashes. I'm not going to say if it's a / or a backslash because, frankly, I don't know which one is which. I typically say /. So with 2 /, you can comment out some of your code. So if we comment out our guitars and we go and refresh the page, well, that wasn't a very good example. I tell you what, let's do this. We will have our print R, and we will print R the guitars once again. And of course, whenever we refresh the page, we are going to see that output followed by guitar does not exist. But if we comment out the print R, we are not going to see the output of the array. We just see the output of guitar does not exist. So that's what a comment is. It is basically just saying that, hey, PHP, ignore this. And it's a nice tool for adding your own comments to your code. So if you wanted to give some insight into some code that you've written so that the future you knows what you did, or somebody else looking at your code knows what you did, you can add some clarity with comments. So this is a traditional array. But PHP also has something called an associative array. And this is kind of the same thing, but it's also a little bit different. So we're going to have guitars 1, and we're going to have guitars 2. So let's do that. We are still going to use the square bracket syntax, but now we have to specify what's called a key and then the value for that key. So if we look at the print R of guitars again, and I didn't change the variable there. There we go. Let's refresh. If we look at this, we have our indexes over here. Well, our indexes, we could also kind of call those keys. So we have our key on the left-hand side, then we have an arrow, which is an equal sign followed by a greater than sign, and then the value. And that's essentially what we do to create an associative array. We specify the key, so I'm going to use the manufacturer as the key, because I'm going to say that this is a list of my favorite guitars. So the first manufacturer is Paul Reed Smith. I'm just going to say PRS. And the value is going to be Vela. And since we have 3 of these, we need to separate them with a comma. So the next is going to be Gibson. And then we have the arrow. The value for Gibson is going to be Explorer. And then we have Fender, which is the manufacturer of the Stratocaster. So there we have Strat. So this is the associative array. We have a key and a value. So you could think of guitars kind of as a lock for multiple doors. And whatever door you want to open, you have to provide the appropriate key. So the PRS key is going to open the door for Vela. So we would do essentially the same thing in order to access these values. We would say guitars, and then whatever key that we used. So PRS in this case. And we have a lot of echoes, so let's just comment out all of that. In fact, let's just comment out everything else so that we just have our associative array. So if we refresh this, now we see undefined variable guitars, of course. See, whenever I change things on the fly like that, it just never turns out well. So we are using the PRS key. We're using essentially the same syntax as we did with indexes, except that we are specifying the key, PRS in this case, and we are getting Vela as the value. So this is also case sensitive. So if we say PRS with a capital P, that is not the same as PRS with a lowercase p, and in which case we see undefined index. So once again, we could do essentially the same thing that we did with our first guitars array. We can use that isSet function, and if that particular key is available, then we will display that value. So if PRS with a capital P is set, then we are going to output that value. Otherwise, we're going to say guitar does not exist. So we should see guitar does not exist, which is just what we wanted, but let's go ahead and let's add a PRS key with an uppercase P. And I also like the Starla. Well, no, the single cut, because the Starla has a Bigsby tremolo, and I'm not a fan of tremolos. So now we have a key of PRS with an uppercase P. We have the value being displayed here, the single cut. And so that is essentially it as far as arrays are concerned. Now in the next lesson, we are going to look at loops. And loops and arrays go hand in hand because loops allow us to loop over an array and output each item within that array. So if we wanted to easily build a list of my favorite guitars, we can do that very easily with a loop. And we will of course do that in the next lesson.